So this study was funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada through the Canada Graduate Scholarship for a Master's. So Sue will be presenting her master's research. And it focused on gathering survivor voices as well as the voices of service providers to offer insight as to how the bond between survivors and their farmed larger companion and working animals impacts the survivor's safety decision making. And I'd like to introduce Sue. Sue is actually a good friend of mine. We've worked together on some GBV and companion animal and large animal work together. So I'm really pleased to be introducing Sue. She's doing amazing work in her master's and also as a PhD student now. So Sue began her career working in early childhood education and completed a bachelor's degree in child development at Seneca College. During her undergraduate degree, Sue worked as a research assistant on a project with therapy dogs in a children's hospital setting. After graduating from her undergraduate degree, Sue worked as a child and youth counselor at a gender-based violence shelter and moved into management roles in both the emergency shelter program as well as the community services program. As a survivor of gender-based violence, Sue was proud to support and develop their off-site animal keeping safekeeping program at that organization. Sue continued her academic journey through pursuing an MED, so Master's of Education, at Western University, where her capstone project focused on the entanglement of violence towards humans, animals, and the environment in early childhood classrooms. During this time, Sue was also working as the program coordinator and later the manager for the ACT project at Humane Canada. The ACT project focused on addressing systemic barriers facing survivors of gender-based violence and their animals. Following the successful completion of the ACT project, Sue managed Humane Canada's Promising Practices project, focused on utilizing humane education to support men and boys in becoming allies to end gender-based violence. Sue also completed her MA on women and gender studies at St. Mary's University and focused her thesis on the impact of the bond between intimate partner violence survivors and farmed and larger companion animals on survivors' safety decision making. Sue was the recipient of the 2024 Canada Graduate Scholarships Master's Scholarship issued by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and Sue has now begun her PhD in sociology at the University of New Brunswick, focusing her dissertation research on help-seeking services for survivors of intimate partner violence and their companion animals. So please join me in welcoming Sue, and I'm very excited to hear this presentation.
Thank you, Valli. Now I'm like very nervous to live up to the kind words you said. Okay, I'm going to share my PowerPoint for everyone. Okay, so it is lovely to have you all here today. I'm so excited to chat with you. Like Valli said, this is my master's thesis research, but I've also included some published literature in this presentation just to kind of give us a well-rounded view. And so I'm very excited to chat with you about this. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to define a few terms. So farmed animals, I define as animals raised for human consumption. The term companion animals I use to refer to small animals, often referred to as pets. The term larger companion animals I'm going to use to refer to companion animals that are larger, like horses, or hobby farm animals like llamas. So essentially animals that are companions but too large to live in a residence. I also utilize the term working animals, and this is to refer to animals providing financial benefits or income to survivors, such as like horses used for riding lessons. I'm using this term as I used it in my thesis, but there is a significant amount of scholarship on working animals that has differing definitions. So I respectfully acknowledge that I live, work, and play on the unsurrendered and unceded traditional Wolastoqey lands. The lands of the Wabanaki people are recognized in a series of peace and friendship treaties to establish an ongoing relationship of peace, friendship, and mutual respect between equal nations. So, as I begin today, I do want to note that the content I will be discussing may be triggering. I will be discussing violence and abuse, including intimate partner violence and animal abuse. Please do self-monitor I'm talking about complex topics, so I encourage you to respect your own needs and take breaks as needed. Please be kind to yourself as we share space today. Language is important, but so is maintaining a space of openness for learning. So I'm going to review some language that I'll be using in my presentation, but I also know that language can be misused and mistakes can be made. And so I want to learn from those mistakes. So if you hold better or different language, I would love to learn from you. Please message me on Whova. As my friend Justine says, I am humble and ready to fumble. And as my friends at Next Gen Men say, we are all speaking in draft, which I love as a way to think about utilizing language while acknowledging the power of language. So the language I'm going to be using is shared with me by Women at the Center, which is a Canadian survivor-led organization. And this includes using survivors rather than victims, declarations rather than stories, reported rather than alleged, aggressor rather than perpetrators, and accomplice rather than ally. I'm also conscious of my use of imagery today, and I do want to contextualize that I'm intentionally using images to represent the many different species of animals that may be familiar to different communities or different survivors of GBV. And so I'm conscious that these images may not necessarily represent best practices regarding animal welfare, such as the inclusion of animals that may be traditionally considered wild. But I really wanted to use the images to provoke thought as to the different animals that may be in survivors' lives. Because in my study, I heard from survivors about their relationships with many, many different animals. And I just want to acknowledge I myself am a survivor, but I know there's also survivors in this space with us today. There's folks who've self-identified and there's folks that have not. And I just recognize that there's a lot of survivors in this space representing their own sector while holding their own survivor history. And I really appreciate the contributions you bring to this work. So I'm going to start by introducing the violence link just because it's foundational to all the work that I've done. And so research shows that violence towards people and violence towards animals are part of a larger pattern of violent crimes that coexist. And there's a strong link between animal violence and human violence, and there's an overlap between animal abuse and intimate partner violence in particular. And in instances of intimate partner violence, when there's an animal in the home, there are higher reports of animal abuse commonly documented. And research also shows that animals are often the primary sources of support for survivors experiencing violence. However, aggressors may use that bond to further intimidate and control survivors. Many survivors may delay leaving if they cannot bring their animals with them, and many may consider returning if they have to leave their animals behind. And I'll talk more about this in a few slides. And then, as noted, aggressors may actually use that bond as a form of coercive control and use those tactics, particularly with companion animals, because when there's incidents where there is not any physical abuse or harm to the animal, these are more likely to go unreported. We know that IPV incidents are already underreported, but IPV incidents with animals are commonly unreported because there's a perception that the incident involving the animal was not important enough to report. So to center ourselves before we start talking about farmed, larger, and working companion animals, I'm going to briefly just discuss the impact of companion animals in relation to gender-based violence. I want to highlight that almost all of the survivors in my study had a mix of companion animals and farmed animals, or companion animals and working animals, or larger companion animals, or a mix of all categories. And so as we discuss the complexities associated with each category of animals, I encourage you to consider the layered complexities and challenges that survivors are facing. So the decision to leave a violent relationship is a difficult one, but there are specific complexities related to companion animals that are in published research. So these include financial concerns that could be related to care, food, veterinary care. There may be a fear of escalation of violence towards the survivor or their children or their animals. Survivors may experience challenges in accessing shelter, particularly if they cannot bring their animals with them. They may be concerned about the impact for their children when they are separated from the companion animals. And this bond can be very impactful to the decision, but also separation can be very traumatic for the survivor, their children, and their animals. So there's a lot of talk at this conference around co-sheltering, but I'm just going to briefly define these terms. So when I get further in, everything kind of makes sense. So when I talk about animal-friendly or co-sheltering, I'm talking about gender-based violence shelters in particular that offer on-site programs where either survivors can have their animals with them in their rooms or on-site in some sort of kennel. And then when I'm talking about off-site animal safekeeping programs, I'm talking more about boarding and fostering programs, which could be facilitated by the GBV shelter or by a community organization like a humane society. And those programs always involve a temporary separation because it is requiring boarding or fostering. And so there are, lots of challenges with particularly the off-site animal safekeeping programs, particularly because a lot of these program timelines don't actually align with the amount of time survivors need in a GBV shelter. But also it can be, again, very traumatic to even be temporarily separated from your companion animal. And then just to highlight, which again, I feel like is talked about in this wonderful conference quite a bit, even if a survivor is able to access one of these programs, they still might experience barriers in moving forward to animal-friendly housing. My context is in Canada. And so in Canada, there's no clear approach to protection for companion animal guardians and housing. And there's one province where there is some legislation to protect pet guardians or companion animal guardians, but there's still discrimination from landlords. Okay, so now we're going to talk about larger companion farmed and working animals. And so when I was in a previous role, a lot of the research really looked at companion animals. But as I was doing that work, I kept hearing from survivors and service providers that there were really big gaps for survivors that had sort of these other types of animals, which led to my research study. And this research study really specifically looked at the bond between survivors and farmed, working, or larger companion animals, but then how that bond impacted the survivors' safety decision-making. So I interviewed survivors in this study that had those types of animals, but I also had focus groups with service providers working for gender-based violence services in remote, rural, and farming communities in Canada. And I just want to say thank you because I didn't do this work alone. So my thesis supervisor, Dr. Crystal Giesbrick, she's one of the few researchers studying survivors in rural, remote, northern, and farming communities with animals. And then Dr. Michelle Byers is my other supervisor who had a lot of knowledge around intimate partner violence and a passion for animals. I want to say thank you to my second reader and my external, both Dr. Rochelle Stevenson, as well as Dr. Kendra Coulter, because they have foundational knowledge when it comes to the violence link, and they really advised me well. And I just want to also thank Shirk. So now we're going to talk about specifically the bond. So again, there was that bond between companion animals that I found in the published literature, but there was also this bond that came out of my study that really looked at survivors with sort of these other types of animals. So for example, one service provider talked about a survivor taking nothing else from her home except for her horse. And so this strong bond was emphasized from both the service providers and the survivors. For survivors, the species of animal did not matter for the strength of the bond. So one survivor described the relationship she had with her cow, and how it was similar to a relationship one would have with a dog. And one of the things she talked about was how her cow was her home. And quite simply, the only emotional support she was getting was from her cow. But service providers talked about how, depending on the species of animal, it would impact whether or not survivors could access services. So with certain animals, both survivors and service providers spoke about a strong bond between the animals and children, and how that bond really impacted the survivor's decision to leave, whether or not they fled with the animals, and then the guilt that they experienced when they could not support their children in maintaining the bond with these animals. And that was particularly seen a lot with horses. And just overall, service providers and survivors really emphasized this emotional impact of the connection between survivors and animals, and talked about how the bond was related to survivors' happiness, how often it was contrasting to the abuse that they were experiencing. One survivor particularly noted that being around her larger companion and farmed animals offered her emotional regulation. And then what she described as reciprocal communication, which I asked her more about. And so she spoke about talking to her goats. And when she would speak to her goats, they would bleat back at her. But when she would speak around the aggressor would actually stonewall her and act like she hadn't spoken at all. So this was a really big contrast for her that she found really supportive. Um, Multiple survivors talked about their animals being offering them emotional support. And this was also connected to radical acceptance. So one survivor who was experiencing sexism, racism, and transphobia from the aggressor talked about how her animals didn't care who she was or what she looked like. They just loved her as she was. And service providers also spoke about how animals don't let survivors down and provide that consistent support. So another theme that emerged was how these types of animals offered healing for survivors. So one of the things that came out was a sense of safety when spending time with them. So one survivor particularly talked about wanting to remain in the paddock with her horses rather than returning to the home where the aggressor was, and how she wished she could stay all night in the paddock with her horses because that felt safer than going into where her bed was. Another survivor talked about how her cow was her inspiration to leave, because she felt she had to leave to be able to build a safer life for her and her cow before something happened, and then she would not be able to provide that care for her cow. And another survivor spoke about her interaction with sheep and how the sheep did not want anything from her. And this felt very healing for her because she was experiencing sexual abuse from her ex-partner at the same time. So overall, the data demonstrated the bond between survivors and their animals is a very personal bond, and it's regardless of species. This was particularly seen with survivors who identified feeling connections to wild animals. So one survivor spoke of feeling connected to a porcupine, deer, and some ducks that would visit her property, and felt the need to remain on the property because of this connection she had. Larger companion and farmed and working animals were really viewed as giving this emotional support and radical acceptance that was really meaningful for survivors. These animals did impact decision making for various reasons, which I'm going to talk about in a few slides. And then the other piece that was really interesting was the species of animals impacted access to service. So smaller animals were seen as easier to accommodate. So for example, one of the service providers talked about accommodating a crow because the crow is considered to be a companion animal. However, other animals were not included, such as like large dogs, which I thought was very interesting. And for survivors, they said multiple times the species of the animals really didn't matter and didn't impact their bond. And for most of my survivors in the study, or most of these survivors in the study, they said that they delayed leaving because of their animals. The exception was the one survivor who left because her cow gave her that courage. But she did have a neighbor nearby who was able to take care of her cow until she could secure safe housing. And so the fates of survivors and animals are really entangled, as both survivors and animals are being oppressed by violence being experienced. And if the survivor leaves, the animal may not be cared for. However, if the survivor does not leave, the survivor may be subjected, and the animal may be subjected to escalating abuse. And if the survivor does leave, the animals still may be used as a method of coercive control to force the survivor to return. So there were numerous barriers and challenges that came up about farmed, working, and larger companion animals. I've tried to organize them because there were so many. So the first is around barriers specific to farmed, larger companion, and working animals. So things like care, transportation. And then the second are barriers specific to rural, remote, northern, and farming communities. So survivors and service providers shared a significant barrier for survivors leaving the relationship was the ongoing abuse and the fear of escalation. So one survivor talked about how she feared lethal violence towards herself and her animals if she attempted to leave at that time. Financial abuse was also really commonly noted by survivors in the study. particularly when survivors left the relationship without their animals. It was often used as a method of coercion. So this included like selling the animals for less than the animals were worth, or using violence towards the animals to coerce the survivor into returning. This also included the abuse towards companion animals that were considered working animals because of the context of the animals living on the farm. So there was an example where the survivor and her children had actually fled to a pet-friendly shelter with their dog that was considered their companion dog. But the children were also very attached to a farm dog that lived on the farm. And the aggressor then attempted to use that bond to coerce the survivor and the children into returning to protect that particular dog. For some survivors who left without their animals, aggressors were intentionally neglecting the care of the animals as a way to further harm or control survivors. Or some were using the care of the farmed animals as a way to have continued contact with the survivor. So service providers actually described multiple examples of survivors returning to the property at regular intervals while staying in shelter to be able to care for the animals, which was a really significant safety risk. And in one example, a service provider shared actually resulted in the murder of a survivor who was returning daily to her property to care for her horse. So this was also a risk because for some survivors, they were able to ask like friends, family, and neighbors to care for their animals and attend the property. But this was a risk for those individuals. And when the aggressor legally jointly owned the animals, often they would deny consent to this care and continue to subject the animals to abuse or neglect to coerce the survivor into returning, even though there was an alternate care option available. So this leads me to animal care, which was a really significant barrier for survivors with these types of animals. So a lot of these animals required significant daily care, which made it really difficult to find alternative care options. And some animals required specialized care or a significant time commitment, which again made it really challenging to find an option for care beyond the survivors themselves. Service providers highlighted that survivors are often geographically isolated. So finding individuals who have the space, the capacity, the expertise for those types of animals is really, really challenging. For some other survivors, they talked about how there's so many animal care barriers that resulted in them having to sell their animals. For one survivor, she talked about wanting to leave and leave her animals behind just temporarily. But the aggressor did not know how to care for her horses because the aggressor had intentionally never learned to care for the horses. And so that led to her having to sell some of her horses. Survivors also shared that there was a big financial impact of leaving the relationship, particularly when they were forced to sell or give up animals that were part of their income because of the cost of animal care once they had fled the property. And one survivor made a really impactful point of how there are limited financial support options for survivors with these types of animals, even though these animals are the survivor's career and source of income. And again, there was just a huge challenge when it came to cost of care, and particularly when the cost of care was previously shared by the survivor and aggressor, when the aggressor stopped providing that financial support due to the survivor leaving. So there are also the logistics of leaving that survivors had to navigate. So this included determining transportation and securing appropriate transportation. Many of the animals in this study, like horses, cows, chickens, sheep, and goats, required trailering for transportation. And this was a really significant barrier because actually securing the trailer without the aggressor learning of the plan can be a challenge, as well as finding transportation to pull that trailer. So one survivor even spoke of she had folks in her life who had trailers that could help her, but they were all very fearful of the aggressor, so they refused to help her. And then even if a survivor can secure that transportation, survivors often had to plan their time to leave around when the aggressor would not be on the property. And so this offered a really limited time window for when survivors could pack up their homes, their animals, and safely leave. So sometimes this window of opportunity didn't align with animal care needs. And the example I was given was milking cows. they require transportation within a certain time frame to make sure they're milked on time. So this is a really significant logistical challenge to determine when to leave, particularly when you have a limited window of opportunity. Survivors in these communities may also be experiencing financial challenges or financial abuse, which again adds to being able to access transportation if you don't have those financial resources. Also, these challenges with transportation were not just experienced when survivors were attempting to leave. It was also impactful for survivors trying to access veterinary care or other services. And as mentioned, there's different considerations for care and safekeeping of these types of animals. And one of those is biosecurity risks for farmed animals, because animals from one farm can't easily be housed with animals from another farm due to these risks. So even when survivors had someone willing to board their animals, like a friend or a family member, the animals had to have space to be quarantined and cared for separately before they could be relocated to that, or when they're relocated to that farm. So, as noted, there were significant financial barriers for these types of animals. For a lot of the survivors, these animals were associated with their income and their livelihood, and their financial security would be significantly impacted, particularly when they left the animals behind, because the aggressor would often maintain access to the animals, but without sharing the profit. For some survivors, there was a lot of concern about the future of the farm, because the operation of the farm required everyone in the family for the farm to survive and thrive. And then survivors who did leave were very fearful that the farm would fail. Again, survivors really struggled with that cost around care. And then the other significant challenges was when it came to property division, and animals being divided within that property division. So there were examples where survivors would flee the relationship and the aggressor would intentionally sell off the animals at a minimal profit to impact the survivor, or intentionally neglect the animals so that the survivor did not receive appropriate compensation. And it's also really important to note that a lot of these communities are rural, remote, northern, and farming communities across Canada. Often for these folks, there's not reliable access to internet or cell services, so that can also impact accessibility to even virtual programming or resources. And so in these communities, there's a lot of concerns around perceived lack of or actual lack of anonymity and confidentiality. So concerns that there's going to be a safety risk if survivors disclose gossip or embarrassment, or the community may shun, isolate, or blame the survivor. And this can make it very difficult for survivors to disclose and access support from neighbors, friends, family, and actual professional support services in the community. But this was a really big concern when it came to these types of animals, because even when survivors were able to find safekeeping options, there was a concern that others in the community would recognize their animals and ask questions or accidentally inform the aggressor. So the example provided was, it was difficult to have a horse fostered by a friend or by a professional, because if someone in the community saw that horse in a different paddock, they would start asking questions. Also, folks in these communities experienced geographical isolation, which was increased because of weather, inaccessible roads, and long distances to support services. And then for some of these communities, they were flying communities or only accessible by ferry, and that can make it really difficult for survivors to leave, particularly with these types of animals. And so again, an example that was provided was if a survivor were to flee with their horses and their horse trailer, it would be very obvious in a small island community of a horse trailer being on the ferry. But also, you couldn't just necessarily decide to leave one day and take your trailer and go. You would have to pre-plan and pre-book. And so that would not allow survivors to sort of leave when they had the opportunity. And additional complexities in these communities, there's limited human services, limited animal sheltering programs, and limited animal services. And this limited access to resources can really trap survivors and their animals with the aggressor. So personal network resources is a term that was generously shared with me by Dr. Rochelle Stevenson. And it's sort of those family, friends, neighbors And so these folks can be really helpful for survivors and helping them to leave and care for their animals. That's what I heard sort of over and over again from survivors. And there were three ways that this happened. It was either helping the survivor actually flee with their animals, so offering a trailer, driving a truck, those sorts of things, or it was offering to come to the survivor's property and provide daily care to those animals, which, as mentioned, does come with a risk. And then the other way was the friends, families, neighbors actually boarding the animals on their own property, or offering sort of that fostering piece. But there were significant challenges with all three of these. Often supports feared retaliation for helping the survivors. As mentioned before, the aggressor may have to actually consent to this care, and a lot of aggressors refused. And a lot of these folks had their own farms. So there were struggles of, the cost of care, their own animal care duties, sometimes a lack of gender-based violence knowledge, sometimes a lack of expertise of this particular species of animals the survivor was responsible for or had a relationship with. So all of this leads to survivors facing an impossible choice, which they may struggle with the implications for that choice in the long term. If survivors have to sell or give up their animals, they may never know what happens to these animals. And in one example, the survivor who had to sell her horse, she spoke of actually tracking that horse being sold from sort of or animal guardian to animal guardian, because she was hopeful that one day she'd be able to buy back her horse, and rebuild the bond between them. I also heard from survivors that they may go to great lengths to maintain their bond with their animals. And I'm so sorry, my cat is going to walk across screen. I'm so sorry, everyone. She likes to be the center of attention. So survivors may go to great lengths to maintain their bond with their animals. But the survivors really wanted to emphasize the lengths that they decide to go is a deeply personal choice. And that is a choice that I heard from service providers is not understood sometimes by others, which can be very painful for survivors. So, as we've discussed the challenges and barriers, there are some current solutions and practices that can help survivors be safe in these situations. So, the first solution is having companion animals being able to access co-sheltering gender-based violence shelters. This was huge for survivors because knowing they could bring their dog, their cat, their companion animals with them meant that they only had to problem solve for sort of their larger companion farmed and working animals, which was a huge relief. Additionally, the offsite animal safekeeping programs were huge for folks. So some of the some of the service providers actually were running boarding and fostering programs, sort of like off the record and as needed for larger animals. And the two examples that I was given were one, a large animal vet clinic had partnered with a shelter to be able to board horses when they could, or donkeys or sort of those types of animals, which was huge. And then the other solution that I heard about was a gender-based violence shelter in a community had, this was really interesting to me, but it was like the service provider's other service provider, colleague, husbands, friends, accountants, client had a feedlot, and they were able to actually provide boarding to a survivor's herd of cattle, which was like hundreds of cattle. So that was really huge and meant that the survivor could flee. The problem is with these solutions that often they require the generosity of the community, which I'm going to talk about in a couple slides. So overall, what I've read and what I saw in my study is there's this positive impact of smaller achievable actions leading to larger sustainable change. And these actions really look different across organizations, these achievable actions. Not everybody was contacting a feedlot, but the key to success was making those small changes to better support survivors with companion animals, which in many cases led to innovative programs and big, brave ideas for farmed, larger companion and working animals. And so that shelter that I talked about with the feedlot, their first step, they were a co-shelter, they were animal friendly, and that's what led them to sort of make these other choices to support different types of animals. This can really look as simple for folks as collecting data if you're working in gender-based violence services, on crisis calls and intake calls to find out if survivors have animals and what types and species of animals they have. I also heard from survivors and service providers the need to educate folks about these types of animals and the barriers and challenges facing survivors with these types of animals. And then from service providers, I heard over and over again, what can really create big changes is building collaborative relationships with other organizations in the community. This work, particularly with these larger animals, cannot be done alone. And even initiating partnerships through small steps can lead to these larger collaborations. Like with that large animal vet, it really started as just a, can we tell you about the work we do? And it led to them really jumping in with both feet and helping survivors with larger animals be able to flee. And I always want to emphasize, supporting survivors with their animals and keeping families together is being trauma informed. So the other big solution was friends, families, family members, and neighbors, and other community members. What I heard from survivors was these were often the first opportunity for support, resources, and information. So one of the things that survivors said was there needs to be more awareness about gender-based violence, the risks, the signs, and also the impact of all types of animals that survivors may be responsible for. So that way, those supports can be educated when survivors initially reach out. And I really also want to highlight the strength of rural, remote, northern, and farming communities. The strength of community relationships can support survivors to rebuild their lives. But it's really important that community members are aware of any risks and that we're creating safety plans that recognize the possibility of retaliation from the aggressor because of support shown to the survivor. I'm so sorry about my cat. So community solutions were seen as potentially, sorry, everyone. Community solutions were seen as a potential solution for survivors with larger companion farmed and working animals. But usually these solutions relied on the generosity of community members as well as specialized knowledge held in that community. So it was just very important to build out sort of those community education and awareness pieces. I also heard about cross-sectoral collaboration being really necessary in urban communities, but also in rural and remote northern and farming communities, because animal and human services all hold different expertise, skills, and a collaboration of these expertise and skills can offer the best possible support to survivors of GBV, particularly when we're thinking innovatively on how we can support survivors with larger farmed and working animals. And it can really assist with the care and safekeeping of animals in even other areas and communities. So they also discussed ways to keep survivors in their home. One of the things that a service provider said that I thought was really impactful was it's easier to keep survivors in their home rather than relocate survivors and make arrangements for animal care during an already stressful time. So one option for that is emergency protection orders. That's what they're called in Canada. I think they're called restraining orders in the States. They're not a perfect solution. There can still be significant risks for survivors from the aggressor, as well as challenges in obtaining these orders. Multiple service providers in the study talked about there's a lack of faith in the justice system, and there's a significant need for training to make sure that emergency protection orders are easier to get, but also consistently applied for, implemented, and held accountable. As well, survivors may be hesitant to access the legal system or police due to previous negative experiences or experiences in which they felt police did not respond appropriately for their safety. Survivors may also feel like a lack of safety if the police have close relationships with certain community members in rural, remote, northern, or farming communities, or because police are not seen as safety leaders in many communities due to their own actions. So currently, there's also a program being piloted in Canada where survivors remain in the home and then the aggressors actually attend shelter and education and counseling programs, but that way the survivor can remain with their larger animals. But I don't believe the findings of that program have been published yet. And then service providers shared really wonderful dream solutions, such as building GBV shelters in rural communities as barn dominiums, but also the need for more GBV shelters in rural and remote communities, because some survivors have to travel hours to access GBV shelter. And the quote I kind of want to leave you folks with came from one service provider. And she said, "The system needs to recognize the prevalence of this violence and recognize that it's a public health issue and a safety issue, and have the overall recognition that this happens, and it particularly happens in these settings of farms that are really important workplaces and home spaces." So thank you so much for listening to me today. Thank you to the My Dog is My Home team for hosting this wonderful conference. I do have a few ways to get involved in this work that I'd love to share before I wrap up. So what I would love for you to learn more about the Canadian Working Group with the Co-Sheltering Collaborative. So I'm one of the co-chairs of the Canadian Working Group. We are actively working towards increasing co-sheltering in Canada. And if you're interested in joining, please message me on Huva. I would love to chat. I'm also lucky enough to be one of the board of directors for the Animal Welfare Foundation of Canada. And I encourage you all to look into the grants that AWFC is offering and the incredible and innovative programs that those grants are supporting to improve animal welfare in Canada. And I'm beginning my own PhD research, which is focused on understanding how the human-animal bond supports healing when the bond is maintained because of co-sheltering and animal safekeeping programs. And so if you'd like to connect with me, I've thrown my email on the screen, and I would love to chat with you. And thank you so much for listening to me.
Oh, there's your cat.
I'm so sorry,
We
everyone.
love seeing her. No, I was seeing the chat and everyone was really happy about a cat cameo. I think this is the perfect conference to have animals show up during a conversation or a presentation. So do not
She was
apologize for her. She's so
she
cute.
was fast asleep. So I was like, I don't need to kick her out of my office, but no, I did. So
Amazing presentation, Sue. I think the work that you're doing is so important. And like I said, a huge gap in kind of the not only the scholarship, but obviously you've highlighted this in your presentation that, there are a lot of gaps when it comes to co-sheltering and gender-based violence, even just in rural communities and the impact that that can have on survivors and their larger animals. And of course, there are a lot of barriers that come with bigger animals and farmed animals that, we certainly have a lot of work to do in this area. But I think the one kind of beautiful thing that came out of your presentation is that, the human animal relationship and the human animal bond is across species, right? It doesn't matter if it's a cat or a goat or a sheep or a dog. I think, you can form bonds with, or a porcupine, you can form bonds with animals regardless of the species, and they can provide so much, support for folks who are going through or experiencing gender-based violence or intimate partner violence in their homes. We've got some questions. So the first question is really interesting actually, and I think it would be kind of cool to see if I don't know if it's out of your scope in terms of the literature that you've come across for your work, but the question is, what are some similarities and differences between escaping violence with large farmed animals and evacuating from a natural disaster with large or farmed animals? What can the two situations learn from each other?
that's such an interesting question.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, so there really isn't a lot of information or literature published on these sort of larger animals when it comes to fleeing gender-based violence. And that's where I feel like perhaps we can learn from sort of the emergency disaster fleeing, because Yeah, there really isn't a lot out there, but I think it'd be so like when I'm now like that should be somebody's thesis. That's genius to look at what can be learned from both sides. I don't have an answer, unfortunately, to that question, but I think it's a brilliant question and
Yeah.
someone should research that.
Yeah, and I think, we experience, large wildfire season up here in, central Canada. And and there were a lot of talks around, at the evacuation of large animals and what to do. And some people are just letting their animals go, right? And putting horses. This was a really cool thing. Like people were tying, like braiding like ribbons in the horses with like a tag that had like the horse's name and their and contact information in case they were found, or like writing numbers on sh with Sharpies on their hooves and stuff. But obviously that's you're probably not going to do that in a GBV context, but I thought that was kind of a cool thing that they were doing. But yeah, I think that's a super great question. Um, the other quick question is, can you repeat the word or phrase you used to describe the dream solution facility? A barn dominium, like a barn and a condominium. Is that exactly what it sounds like? A barn plus housing?
Yeah, so I did not come up with this solution. This was the brilliant service providers. I had this question where I asked them all as a group, if you had a magic wand, what would you create to fix this? And so they talked about, they described it as a barn dominium where it would be sort of a barn on the bottom where survivors could have many species of animals. And then on the top, it would be like the offices for the counselors and also like the rooms for the survivors to stay in. So I thought that was a genius solution. I think, of course, there's things to be worked out there because, like I talked about, there's, those biosecurity pieces and figuring all those pieces out. But it was a really beautiful solution. And particularly in rural communities where there are going to be these animals and there aren't GBV shelters yet, this would be a great model to build for building a GBV shelter.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, rural communities and remote communities are really lacking in just kind of health services to begin with. So, let alone GBV, let alone, farmed animals. I don't like in my work in remote communities, we haven't seen a lot of like, bigger farmed animals, but I've seen chickens. I've seen, people using, having chickens as food security, but also, tons of chickens in an area. So yeah, it's definitely an important problem. It's a wicked problem, as a lot of people say, but it's an important one to tackle. Um, Someone else asked, great point about a big part of the solution being the community itself, especially in rural areas. Do you have any examples of good community outreach efforts or campaigns that can help educate slash provide resources to community members about the need to place or transport large animals for DV survivors?
So not yet. So I will say I'm working on, and it's going slow because school has taken over my whole world, but I'm working on creating like a PDF resource that could be shareable for folks, just talking about sort of what we learned in the study, but also sort of like practical, like here's what you can do and here's how you could help, whether it be you're a GBV organization or you're just, a community champion who wants to be responsive. But there is a really great training called Neighbors, Friends, and Family, and I believe Western University offers it. It's free. And so it doesn't specifically talk about these types of animals, but it gives folks a really great foundational knowledge around gender-based violence, which I think is really needed. Even in this study, like one of the survivors who fled to a neighbor's house with her horses, the neighbor really struggled with wrapping around their mind that the survivor had been experiencing gender-based violence because they were looking for certain cues that aren't necessarily there in every relationship and aren't necessarily the red flags or warning signs. And that was something that was really impactful to the survivor because they felt like they weren't believed at first. And so simply educating folks on the many different ways gender-based violence presents can really help those folks be sort of ready and able to support in a trauma-informed way if someone discloses to them. I
Yeah,
hope that answered
amazing.
that.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, another question is, what is the most impactful way service providers can support survivors with larger companion, farmed, or working animals? Your opinion.
This comes from survivors, so I won't take credit for this. I want to credit the amazing survivors who shared their stories with me. And what they told me was ask about their animals. It's that simple. Even if service providers can't offer a solution about their horse or their goat or their herd of cattle, just asking about those animals and even attempting to talk about what could you do to safety plan around these animals was hugely impactful because it validated for survivors the bonds that they had with those animals and their prioritization of their animals and those sorts of things.
Yeah, amazing. I think people just need to be asked sometimes because some folks won't disclose, right, about their
Totally.
animals.
And that was something that came out on the service provider side was one of the service providers said, well, as soon as someone mentions those animals, I stop asking questions because we won't be able to help them. But for survivors, just asking, I hear you have a horse. Like, have you thought about what you want to do with your horse if you were to flee? Really was meaningful to them.
Okay. Yeah, that's amazing. And let me go through our questions here. Um, okay, so this is an interesting question. Maybe, okay, how would bigger cities implement this type of co-sheltering? I know that, a lot of cities don't have, like, if we think about cities in an urban context, but there
Right.
are cities in rural contexts that could be, a way could impact or help out in some capacity.
Yeah, and I also one of the things that came out in the study that I like couldn't fix, I had to shave a lot off of this presentation to fit it in the time. But urban chickens, like a lot of folks in urban communities have chickens, and so that was talked about by service providers. And in that conversation, the service providers that offered co-sheltering, most of them were like, "We'll find a way to make it work." But when you ask that question, I often think of like Guelph, Ontario is this perfect example of like a suburban setting, an urban setting where there's sort of this rural community right on the outskirts. So a lot of folks accessing services in Guelph are going to have horses, are going to have, llamas, are going to have sheep. And so I think when it comes to urban settings, I think it's really like when I think of Guelph, Ontario, I think of the Guelph Humane Society and how immensely creative they are. So they've had folks that have pigs and what they do, so the Humane Society offers a fostering slash boarding program, but when they have what they call unusual animals, they have like an amazing network where they just reach out to folks after folks so that they can find even a temporary short-term place for those animals, because giving survivors sort of that temporary short-term opportunity lets them sort of escape the crisis, escape the violence, and make some sort of plan while maintaining that bond with their animals. So I hope that answers that. I think just having
Oh,
that
that's great. Yeah.
creative, we can
Mhm.
solve this mindset.
And I think it also comes back to like, community, their rural communities are so tight knit to begin with. And like that
Yeah,
can be a barrier, of course. But it can also be an opportunity, right? And it can
yeah,
really you can really go to that community for help, and people are always kind of willing to help each other out. I mean, I see that in remote northern communities. It's just
yeah.
that's the way it is. You're there and you help your neighbors, right? So yes, it can be a barrier, but it can also be quite an opportunity to kind of tap into that community as well.
I think automatically of the example of that feedlot, like it was like someone knew someone who knew someone who knew
Yeah.
someone, and all of a sudden we had a solution for 300 cows, So
Yeah,
it really is the strength of the community.
absolutely. We only have a few minutes left. Someone kindly asked Sue and Valli, what are your dream solutions? Um, what are your dream solutions, Sue? I'm going to let you go first because you're the expert here.
I'm
So,
definitely not definitely not the expert. I would say companion animal co-sheltering every single IPV shelter across Canada. So, and every shelter across Canada is
yeah.
co-sheltering. That's step one. A lot of basically every single survivor I spoke to, except for one, had companion animals and these other animals.
Mm.
Um, that's step one. And then I think just having communities where there's sort of networks of support, where, folks are informed and educated about gender-based violence and, ready to jump in with an extra paddock or bales of hay or whatever is needed to support survivors from there. Valli, what's your dream solution?
I don't know. I mean, I agree. I think, when you said that, I think there's a lot more gender-based violence that's happening in rural or remote communities than we actually think there is. And so I think that kind of, knowledge sharing is going to be kind of the first step, right? And then, and also looking at the signs that are not those like outright, like in your face. Oh, my cat made an appearance. This is Peaches, everybody. She likes to make an appearance.
Hi, Peaches.
Um, but yeah, I think that kind of knowledge sharing aspect, having people more informed about what gender-based violence can look like. It's not just your typical kind of what we think it may look like, and that it takes a lot of different forms and shapes. And I think that's definitely the first step. And I think there needs to be more funding, for rural and remote communities in this space for sure, because I think it is, and more research, which is amazing what you're doing. So yeah, I think your research is going to have a huge impact in this space for sure, in Canada especially, where a lot of our communities are remote and rural. So
Can
yeah.
I jump onto that though? Because if we're
Yeah.
doing unlimited funding, I think that survivors should just be given a pocket of money of like, you're fleeing a relationship, here's some money so you can decide what you need to
Yeah.
flee, whether it's trailering, whether, um, that
Yeah.
would be ideal.
Awesome. I think that was a great question to end on. Thank you so much for joining, everyone. This was a really, I hope that you've been inspired to, think of new solutions in the co-sheltering space when it comes to bringing these types of animals in. So, thanks, Sue.
Thank you, everyone.
Chasing the night away, never judging.